It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
It is time now for something that we've frankly never really done before, quite like this anyway. It's Take Command Live on the radio. Logan Paulsen joining me. What's up?
Not much, man. Just trying to keep track of all this free agency stuff.
Excellent. Well, that's what we have you here for, is to have you talk about all the NFL free agency stuff, including, let's start reverse chronologically here, because as we sit here doing this, some people will hear this later on the Take Command feed. But as we sit here doing this, it is just after 6 o'clock, and the Commanders have just agreed to terms with former Panthers linebacker Frankie Luvu. He seems to be able to do a lot of different stuff. Seems to be a play with your hair on fire, fast, physical kind of guy that Dan Quinn wants. What do you see when you watch Frankie Luvu?
Yeah, obviously he's a guy that you remember from earlier in the year. Just having some ability to get some stuff done in terms of like rushing the passer from the edge, playing in the 5-man front. I think the thing that sticks out to me most is that he's an aggressive guy downhill to the football. I think he's got some coverage ability. Like I watched him in season and was like, oh my gosh, this guy can really roll. Like, let me make a note of that. So I'm really excited that he's here. And I just started watching his film, right before the call, because he was signed like 20 minutes ago or whatever it was. But he's a guy that gets you excited, right? Like he's got some growth to do, obviously, but the flexibility you mentioned, I think the ability to rush the passer, the ability to do some coverage stuff, I think is very, very special. So, I think that's kind of what I'm looking at there. And it's something that he fills a role. I think he's young. I think that's exciting. And I think he's a guy that, like you said, I think Daniel's going to have a pretty solid vision for. So.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the fast physical nature of who he is makes him a very obvious pick. My biggest question is, can he play Mike? Like, is this a guy that when you watch him on film, you're like, this is the guy that's going to play next to Jamin Davis? Or do you think this is a longer term vision type of thing where he's either playing alongside Jamin and someone else, or is he Jamin's replacement sooner rather than later?
I think that's a good question. I think he's got some traits that say, maybe he can play middle linebacker. But I think, like with anything, like with the draft and like with the agency, it's a little bit of projection. It's a little bit of a projection of this scheme. And I do think that he, like I said, he does some stuff that Dan, I think, really values a lot. Like he has the ability to kind of put his hand in the ground. Like if you watch Dallas tape last year, Dallas tape from 2 years ago, Anthony Barr's lined up at defensive end. And what they do there with those guys that are kind of in these flex rusher positions is they make it hard for the offensive line to identify known rushers and unknown rushers. And so they did that a little bit last year with Kyle Van Noy. Anthony Barr obviously had like kind of a more of a flavor for it, playing defensive end in college. I think he gives you a little bit of that. And I also think, again, like that flexibility is awesome, but I think he could project to a guy who could play Mike linebacker. Like it's hard to tell exactly when you're watching Carolina's defense. Like, is he the Will? He's a Will sometimes. He's the Sam sometimes. Looks like he's the middle of three in other looks, but I don't think it's overwhelming for him. And so I think, like, again, you mentioned the flexibility, and a guy that's done multiple things, been in the league for about 5 years now from the looks of the stuff on PFF. So again, I think, yes, he could project to somebody in the middle of defense, and I think it bodes well that he's played multiple different spots, because he obviously understands the defense in Carolina well enough to do those different things. And that's a very complicated defense, specifically in terms of the types of fronts they play and the type of coverage structures. Not coverage structures, but they ask those linebackers to do a lot. So I feel very confident that he transferred very well to this position here in Washington. It's just about kind of finding, the chemistry and who fits best where. But I do think he could potentially play Mike at some point, yeah.
So that obviously leads to a discussion of Dorance Armstrong and what role he plays. The first signing of the day, a guy that Dan Quinn is very familiar with. He played some inside, some outside, but is largely going to be a defensive end. I'm guessing you've watched a little bit of him. Obviously, you've studied him over the last couple of years in scouting Dallas twice a year when we were preparing for the podcast and the Commanders were about to play them. What do you like? What do you see as a role here for Dorance Armstrong?
Well, obviously, I think, the familiarity with Dan is something that I really appreciate. And also, I think the flexibility that he brings, like when you watch Dallas, I think the thing he does so well is he's listed as a defensive end, but he also can rush over a guard and rush pretty effectively over the guard. He's listed at 255, and he plays bigger than that to me. He's got a better power profile than that. So that's something that I enjoy watching when I watch him. I like guys that are physical. He's got a motor that won't quit, and I like the flexibility he gives you in the front. He kind of reminds me of like a more seasoned, a better KJ Henry, a guy that maybe isn't going to wow you with like athletic measurables, or at least something that doesn't pop on film, but a guy that's just a good football player, kind of has a role, understands what he does well, and understands what Dan wants. And so I think like that's super important in this time, is like making sure you bring players in that understand Dan's vision, or understand Witt's vision, excuse me, for the defense. And I think having voices that can echo the kind of mentality. And when you watch film, he feels like a guy that's kind of a blue collar, hardworking type of guy. And again, the flexibility that he brings, I think, is going to be very, very important. So I like that signing. I've always liked him, as a kind of a rotational guy. It'll be interesting to see if he's kind of the starter coming in, or if they kind of embrace more of a rotational situation here. So something to keep an eye on, but a guy that I've liked. I think he's a good football player. And I think he adds value again, because he gives you some flexibility defensively.
So I think that my question now for the Commanders when it comes to defensive end is, are they done? Like, if they're done, are they okay? And I'm going to say done is they re-sign either James Smith-Williams or Casey Tuo, which, by the way, is by no means a guarantee. But I definitely think that can be done if they want it to, one of those two guys. And so let's say they were to enter the season with a draft pick. And I'm not going to necessarily say it has to be at 36 or 40, but I think there's certainly some guys, if folks have listened to the podcast or listened to our mock drafts that we played on the radio show, know that Darius Robinson, for instance, is a guy that we both really like. But if they were to have some kind of pass rush guy, Dorance Armstrong, one of JSW and Casey, and then KJ Henry and Andre Jones Jr. and the guys that are left over, is that enough, or should they still be in like the Danielle Hunter market, for instance, and some of these other pass rushers that are still available?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't think so. I don't think the Danielle Hunter market's on the table. I think they should look to sign someone else potentially, right? I think I'd like you to have 9 guys that you feel pretty good about, that are going to have a healthy competition for that position in camp. And so, yeah, is that re-signing James? Is that re-signing Casey? I think potentially. And I also think it's important to remember like Andre Jones and KJ Henry. And the thing that gets me excited for this defense, for this team, is I do think that the coaching staff here, has a precedent, has a history. I've worked with Dan, and he does have a really good feel for developing young players and getting the most out of them. So I'm excited. And I think, in this year, it's a retooling year. I understand that. I don't think they're going to go all in this year. I think they're going to kind of lay the foundation with some guys like Armstrong, guys that understand the vision, that can kind of get the message across, can fill a role for you. But ultimately, I think they're going to still build. I think the building process is going to go out for a couple of years. So I don't think all the answers will happen this year. But I do think if some young guys develop, if they trust their coaching, if they trust the talent that they've acquired here, I think they'll be okay. But I wouldn't be surprised if they went out and signed another kind of Armstrong level free agent that had some upside. And again, we talked about Luvu, if I'm saying his name correctly, and I think one of the things that he does so well is that he brings some of that flexibility. He can play a little bit of edge. I know you don't want him doing that full time, but there's another piece there that kind of into sprinkles in there. So maybe it's not, what fans here are accustomed to, where it's Chase Young and Montez Sweat. It's a more diverse, eclectic approach, kind of maximizing individual skill sets and saying, this is your role on the team, and therefore kind of making the sum of the parts better than the total better than the sum of the parts.
That's something that I think Keim has also started to mention, for instance, on his show, that like Jamin Davis is going to get some of that too. It's going to be in very limited doses, but the idea that the players that are here are going to do the things they've done before is not what we should be thinking at all. And so I think of taking that to the two guys that have been paid as well, in Daron Payne and John Allen. And I'd imagine that they mix and match a little bit, get it some outside, and could you see like some wacky pass rush set where it's like Armstrong and Payne on the edge with, Luvu and Jamin like plugging the A-gaps up the middle on a third down, and you're doing something wacky. Like that kind of creativity is stuff we're going to have to start wrapping our mind around. Probably not that specific thing, but who knows? The idea that you're going to see different stuff is going to become the norm here versus the very vanilla, hey, we drafted a bunch of talented dudes, let's line up and just hope that it works out, that I think we've seen the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. That's what I'm excited to see. Like when you watch Dallas, one of the beautiful things about that defense is how innovative they are and how well coached they are across the defensive line. And Armstrong, like I said, I think is a good player, someone that I've liked for a long time, but he's not Montez Sweat, he's not Chase Young. And I think the defensive tackle there, number 97, again, a very talented guy, but he's not blowing the doors off anybody, right? So I think they have pieces, but what they did a great job of is saying, this is our stud. This is the guy that we're going to kind of build the defense around, and Micah Parsons. And all these other guys, we're going to find what they do well. So, like finding that Armstrong can rush a guard, has a great inside wiper, can make a guard move his feet and create pressure that way because he's got enough power, he's got enough strength. I think that stuff is going to be important. Like you mentioned, James and Casey, like or Dre and KJ. Like, what do they do well, and how can they maximize? I think about Casey. One of the things that I think has been often overlooked here in terms of his skill set, in terms of the previous coaching staff, is he's tremendously athletic in terms of height, weight, speed, explosive measurements. So why don't we find a way to maximize that skill set? James can rush inside and outside. He would allow you to do kind of some of the stuff you're describing. Maybe we put Payne and Allen on their worst pass protectors, and then Armstrong and James get the poor matchups, or Andre gets the poor matchup, and then you get advantages that way. So I definitely think that's something I'm really excited to see with this group, and it makes me think it's less important that they go out and spend big money in free agency. Obviously, good football players lead to good football teams, but there's also a dollars and cents element here that I think needs to be considered. So I'm excited to see these guys, the staff, and how they maximize the guys that they have here.
All right, offensive side of the ball, the one move they made so far today is Tyler Biadasz, center who spent the last bunch of years to start his career in Dallas. I've kind of said I thought that Ricky Stromberg being able to start was important this year because he was a third rounder last year. Like, that is a pretty high draft capital pick. But realistically, I like this a lot because it's a veteran center to go with what you presume will be a rookie quarterback. And that changes the dynamic. And also, you're not going to hold the third-round pick made by the last group against this group. You got to maximize looking forward. It doesn't matter in terms of looking back. So that's kind of where I'm at on Biadasz. I think he seems to be a very good fit here. He's had a lot of success in Dallas. He seems to be a no-nonsense guy from what I can gather from friends that I have down there. Physical, sets of mentality, got some training camp scuffles, like kind of fits the toughness mold of what you want. What do you see when you watch Tyler Biadasz on tape, and what do you make of the signing overall?
Yeah, so I haven't watched Tyler Biadasz yet, to be totally candid. And again, but I do think it makes me feel a lot better about this team going into the draft, and just kind of having that piece off the board, so to speak, right? And you've got Wiley, you've got Cosme, you've got the center kind of taken care of, maybe a young player at guard, Chris Paul, whoever it is there. We'll see what happens. Obviously, I think they'll make some more moves there to kind of shore that up. But it kind of is like one piece that you don't have to worry about quite so much. Now you can kind of focus on that left tackle position, the left guard position, and just making sure you get your best five on the field. And again, this is a group I also think they probably make a couple more signings in terms of free agency. It might not be first, second, or third wave. It might be post draft, whatever that is. But I definitely look for them to kind of stockpile some stuff here. And again, we've talked about this on previous shows. I think it's fantastic that there is such great O-line depth, especially in the top 75, 80 picks in the draft. So I think they'll have an opportunity to do a lot of damage in terms of shoring stuff up there. But I'm really happy that they've kind of gotten someone in there who's played consistent football. And again, people say, "Oh, well, what about Bates?" Bates was a different situation. He was kind of, rotating. He was their swing guy, and you were kind of projecting.
Gates, you're talking about Nick
Gates. Yeah, Gates. Did I say Bates? Sorry, Gates. That's exactly right. So, and you were kind of projecting him to a starting role. Here, this guy's done it. He played over 1,000 snaps last year. He's been in that. He's been in the trenches. He's done that kind of stuff. So, I think it's someone you can feel much more confident about.
It also seems like, again, an attitude play, and that's the thing I like about all of these guys. I don't know Armstrong on that personality side as well, but, the first thing I got back in a text from one of my buddies who works in Dallas about Biadasz is like, yeah, he's a scrappy guy. He doesn't really mess around with the media as an offensive lineman. He just wants to go out and play. And I'm like, that dude and Sam Cosme are going to become best friends. Not that Sam's bad with the media, but, like, they just want to play ball. And they want to scrap it out, and like they have a toughness about them. And then, we have Anish Shroff, who's the play-by-play voice of the Panthers, on talking about Luvu, and he's like, Derek Brown was the best player. Brian Burns is probably the most touted player and is awesome. but Luvu was the heart and soul of that defense. And so I think you add that to like Zach Ertz, and again, we hear Peters at his press conference talk about character and Quinn talk about character. They've really backed that up with the guys they've signed, as well as signing players at position of need, because at the end of the day, they do have to line up and play somewhere.
Yeah, and I think like if you look at what happened in 2017 with San Francisco, referencing Adams' experience here, I think they did something very similar. They weren't going out and trying to get the most expensive or the most talented guys. They wanted cultural pieces, and I think like you alluded to there, like that's essentially what they're doing here. Like Luvu, when you watch him on film, like he plays like a lunatic. Like, and I love it. He's physical. He's not always in the right spot. Like people make mistakes. He's not a perfect player, but the energy, the toughness, the physicality he brings, the flexibility of the defense he brings. I mentioned this with Armstrong. Like I was watching his kind of his key plays as a pass rusher, and he is relentless, man. He's getting pushed down. He's crawling to the quarterback. He's doing whatever it takes, and he has a lot of sacks where he's kind of sticking with the play longer than the tackle and makes the play. And I think there is value to getting guys like that in the building, guys that are going to set your standard at a very high level. And kind of, again, this is the foundation year. Everyone retool, whatever you want to call it, right? This is the foundation year. So make sure you and they might not be here long-term, but you want guys in year one that say, this is how we do things as a Commander. This is what Dan wants us to do. And I think it's great that they've got 3 guys, that just like from 1,000-foot view, obviously we're going to watch more. We're going to talk about these guys more later, but like from 1,000-foot view, from the 50 plays I've watched of each of them, I'm just like, I'm excited, and again, from the reputation stuff that you've been able to gather, like it's going to be a really cool opportunity for this team. And I think it's the right approach.
We'll, of course, do a full podcast with full film breakdowns, all these guys, and kind of have a more comprehensive view once the full free agent class is in later this week on Take Command. But for now, that'll do for the Commanders portion of this Take Command live on the Hoffman Show. Real quick, though, Logan, before we let you go, thoughts on some of the other big free agent moves, starting with Kirk Cousins to Atlanta. Big money, 4 years, 180, 100 of it's guaranteed. To me, this vaunts them immediately to the top of the NFC South. I love the fit. Kirk finally reunited with some of the Washington folks after the years of rumors of Kyle and Sean wanting him to come to San Francisco and LA. Raheem Morris, the guy who gets him. What do you make of the fit down there, and just how good can Atlanta be if Kirk is, let's say 85% of what he was last year coming off the Achilles?
I mean, 85%, that's good enough to win the division down there. Like you said, I'm really excited. First off, congratulations to Kirk. Like, awesome guy, works his tail off, has put himself in the position to make this kind of money and do these things financially for him and his family. So fantastic job by him. And again, like you look at the skill players down there, Bijan Robinson, Kyle Pitts, Drake London, and they're going to be able to probably draft one of those big. You think they can draft a big receiver at 8? I mean, golly, like that would be pretty tremendous if Neighbors or Dunze or even Brock Bowers takes a little bit of a slide there, and you just get another offensive playmaker for him to kind of mess around with there would be pretty fantastic. And the way he was playing last year was he was a top 10 player at the position. So I think it's fantastic for Atlanta. Really excited for Kirk. And it's always good when you see good guys by my understanding and by my relations to him get rewarded. So that's awesome.
In the division for the Commanders, NFC East, Eagles sign Barkley. They also get Bryce Huff. What do you make of what they have been able to do?
It's interesting. Like, I think, Philly to me was for a long time kind of the gold standard of how to flip a franchise and like rebuild. And right now, one of the things that if I was going to be critical of Philly, and, if you're a Philly fan, please call in and talk to Craig about it. But the thing I've noticed is that they are really willing to spend a ton of money. And I don't necessarily always see the identity fit with the organization. Like the Saquon Barkley thing's really interesting. I think getting him in the backfield, on paper with Jalen Hurts is really interesting. But like, you're investing a lot in a running back, and you've been able to be very successful just kind of trotting whoever you want in there for the last couple of years, right? Obviously, edge rusher is extremely important. Bryce Huff, I think, is a heck of a football player, heck of a pass rusher, but how does he fit with your vision, especially with like Fletcher Cox kind of moving on? Like you've always kind of been a power rushing team, and now you've got, Nolan Smith from Georgia, you've got Hassan Reddick, and now Bryce Huff, who are a little bit more squirrely on the edges. Does that affect how you kind of coach and develop those guys? Potentially. I think he's an excellent football player. Like he's probably my number one kind of under the radar free agent in this class outside of Danielle Hunter. You know what I'm saying? Like really excited for that. But again, that's one thing that I'm always kind of questioning with them in terms of free agency. I think they do such a good job in the draft, but free agent wise, like, does this fit who you want to be offensively and defensively? And I think only time will tell.
Yeah, definitely. They also definitely wanted Xavier McKinney, the safety from New York. He gets out of town, winds up in Green Bay. They've had an interesting day signing Josh Jacobs, letting go of Aaron Jones. Also let go of David Bakhtiari. The one position, I guess I will do one more Commanders thing real quick. I would love to see them sign one of these veteran tackles, take a flyer on them. Tyron Smith, Bakhtiari, anybody else that's become available. Any of those guys particularly interesting to you for Washington?
Yeah, I think they're all very interesting, and I think there's been a precedent set recently of kind of older guys going to new locations. Armstrong, Peters, Whitworth, all these guys who've played for a long time, that have been relatively successful. And obviously with Armstrong, like, you're negotiating injuries all the time. He's going to miss 3 or 4 games a year. I think it's kind of the same with Tyron Smith. But does he make your team better on those other 13, 14 games to kind of offset some of that? I would probably argue yes, and I think if they've got a great, strength staff over there in Washington, maybe they can help him kind of get right and figure out kind of how help manage loads a little bit better. So I'd love that. I think the other guy that's interesting is Jonah Williams. Again, he's been a little bit up and down, but I think the price point would probably be better, in terms of like what you're expecting. He's also 26 years old. So those types of guys, if you can get and again, I think it would fit with kind of their vision. If you can get kind of I hate to say bargain bin, but like a second tier free agent and a guy that fits your offensive vision, I think that would be pretty special. So I would love, to your point, I'd love for them to find one of those guys. And I don't want to give you a name because I think that they've done such a good job of kind of saying, this is who a Commander is now. This is someone who fits Adam Peters, Dan Quinn's vision. So until that kind of all gets worked out, like I'm kind of excited to see what they do with that spot, because I think it's going to be another one of these guys that I think are just like kind of like little diamonds in the rough, which is always exciting.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you can get a tackle, you are now at the point where you don't need anything in the draft. You can upgrade at a bunch of positions, almost all of them, in fact, but you no longer we can't field a roster if you can get a tackle. That's the one position where you still kind of have that, in my opinion. I literally don't know who their starting left tackle would be if the season started tomorrow. And so I do think that that's something where if they need to get one of those guys. And whether it's Jonah Williams, like you said, a little bit younger option, whether it's Tyron Smith, whether it's David Bakhtiari, you got to get one of them. And then you also attack it in the draft. This is an and, not or situation. All right, that's our first ever true Take Command live on the Hoffman Show. If you want to listen back to any of it because you missed any part of it here live on the Team 980, just go to the Take Command podcast feed in a little bit. Our producer William will have it up there. Anthony's going to podcast it on the Hoffman Show feed. It's everywhere. There's no excuses for not listening to every second of this conversation. Logan, talk to you later in the week, buddy. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it, bud.